Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Here is something worth carrying with you tonight. The name Han, as in the Han Dynasty of ancient China, is still the name that over 90% of China's population uses to describe their own ethnic identity. Not the Qin, not the Tang, not the Ming, the Han, a dynasty that rose nearly 2,200 years ago, lasted roughly 4 centuries, and collapsed almost 2,000 years ago, is still the word a billion people reach for when they say who they are. That kind of staying power does not happen by accident. If you are new here, welcome, and if you have been with me a while, genuinely glad you came back. If you enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps more than you might think. And wherever you are tonight, whether it is past midnight in Manila, late evening in London, or somewhere quiet in the American South, drop your location and local time in the comments. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and I love knowing just how far this reaches. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let everything around you go a little quiet. Tonight, we are going back to ancient China, to a world that had just been through something like a controlled explosion. The most powerful empire on earth had just come apart at the seams, and out of everything that followed, something entirely new was about to be built. For 11 years, the Qin Dynasty had held China together through something closer to organized force than genuine loyalty. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, had unified a deeply fragmented land in 221 BC after centuries of warring states grinding each other down. He standardized the writing system, the currency, the weights and measures across a vast territory. He built roads. He extended existing walls into something approaching a continuous northern barrier. He created a centralized administrative structure that had never existed before in China on that scale. By almost any measure, he was a historical force of nature, a man who bent a continent to a single will. But empires held together by will alone tend to have a particular kind of fragility. The moment that will disappears, everything held by it begins to shift. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BC while travelling, reportedly still searching for some form of immortality that his court physicians kept promising and never delivering. His death was kept secret for weeks, long enough for the officials surrounding his caravan to arrange the succession in their own favour. His younger son, Qin Shi, was placed on the throne through a conspiracy engineered largely by a court official named Zhao Gao, who stands as one of history's more unsettling examples of what a single determined person in exactly the right administrative position can accomplish. Zhao Gao removed rivals, intercepted correspondence, and cultivated the new emperor's paranoia so effectively that within a few years the court had turned almost entirely against itself. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the rest of China was running out of patience in a very practical way. The Qin government had not softened after the first emperor's death. Taxes remained heavy. Conscript labour for state construction projects, roads, walls, palaces continued at the same pace. The legal code, which had always been notoriously precise in its punishments, kept functioning exactly as designed. Peasants who failed to meet their government obligations on time, even when delayed by flooding or impassable roads, faced penalties under a system that treated lateness as indistinguishable from defiance. In 209 BC, this particular logic produced a rebellion almost by accident. A group of roughly 900 conscript soldiers were marching through what is now Anhui province toward a northern garrison posting. Heavy rains had swollen the roads into something closer to rivers, and they were running behind schedule. Under Qin law, arriving late to a military post carried the death penalty. 2 of their leaders, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, worked through the available options and arrived at a fairly straightforward conclusion. The punishment for arriving late and the punishment for open revolt were essentially the same. They raised the flag of rebellion. It was not an organised uprising with a political philosophy. It did not have a strategic plan beyond the immediate moment. But it was the first spark, and within months, fires were burning across the empire. Old aristocratic families from the pre-Qin warring states, families whose lands and titles the first emperor had absorbed, sensed an opportunity. Regional commanders began making their own calculations. The Qin administrative machine, already hollowed out by court intrigue, could not contain what was happening at its edges. Among the many figures who rose during this period was a man named Liu Bang. Liu Bang was not from the aristocracy. He was not a professional soldier or a trained strategist. He had grown up in what is now Jiangsu province, the son of a farming family, and had worked his way into a minor government role as a local official responsible for moving convict labourers to their assigned work sites, a job that fell somewhere between administrator and escort. He was known in his own community as someone who had a relaxed relationship with physical labour, a fondness for wine, and an unusual ability to attract capable people to his side without anyone being entirely able to explain why they wanted to follow him. When the rebellion spread, Liu Bang released his prisoners, gathered a small band of followers, and joined the movement. He was somewhere in his mid-40s at the time. History does not usually expect its great turning points to begin with a middle-aged former convict escort from a farming village. But history, in this particular instance, had not yet caught up with Liu Bang. What he possessed, and what made him genuinely formidable in a chaotic environment, was an instinctive understanding of other people. He could read who was trustworthy, who needed flattery, who should be kept close and watched. He assembled around himself a circle of advisors and generals who were, in several individual cases, far more gifted than he was in their specific areas. He was entirely comfortable with that arrangement. He did not need to be the most brilliant person in the room. He simply needed to be the person the brilliant people chose to work for. This is rarer than it sounds. His principal rival in the contest to succeed Qin was Xiongnu, and the contrast between the two men is the kind that historians find genuinely difficult to set aside. Xiongnu came from old military aristocracy. He was physically imposing and personally brave. He was a tactician of real skill, who destroyed the main Qin field armies in engagements that contemporaries described with something approaching awe. By every outward measure, he was the more impressive figure in the room. He was also, at a fundamental level, a conqueror who had not fully considered what he intended to do after conquering a man built for war who had little patience for the slower, more frustrating work of governance. The conflict between Liu Bang and Xiongnu, known in Chinese history as the Chu-Han contention, unfolded over roughly 4 years following the Qin collapse. It involved shifting coalitions, battlefield reversals, retreats and recoveries, and at least one famous near-miss, the feast at Swan Goose Gate, where Liu Bang narrowly avoided assassination through a combination of luck, quick judgment, and a loyal general who inserted himself physically into the situation to buy enough time for Liu Bang to quietly disappear. By 202 BC, Liu Bang had won. Xiongnu, surrounded near the Wu River and abandoned by his remaining followers, died by his own hand rather than face capture. The man from the farming village, who had been a minor local official not 10 years earlier, was now the ruler of China. He took the title Emperor Gaozu of Han Gaozu, carrying the meaning of high ancestor or high progenitor, and turned to the very large question of what came next. The Qin model had already demonstrated what it cost to run a continental empire through fear and rigid control. Something genuinely different was going to be required. What that different thing would look like and how it would be assembled from the rubble of 2 broken regimes would take years to determine. But in 202 BC, with the civil war finally over, and an exhausted country looking for almost anything resembling stability, the Han Dynasty had begun. The man who should not have won. Liu Bang was born somewhere around 256 BC in a small settlement called Zhongyang Village in the state of Chu, a place that left almost no historical trace beyond the fact that he came from it. His father appears in the historical record mainly as someone Liu Bang himself treated with visible indifference for most of his adult life, which the ancient sources note without much editorial comment. He had brothers. He had a community. He grew up around fields and seasonal labour and the ordinary rhythms of rural life in a part of China that had not yet been absorbed into any empire. What the historical sources do preserve about his early years paints a picture of someone who fit awkwardly into the expectations placed on young men of his background. He was not interested in farming. He avoided the kind of sustained physical work that defined daily life in agricultural communities. He preferred the company of people who had something interesting to say, and he had a particular gift for finding those people and keeping them near him. His younger brother apparently ran the family farm while Liu Bang spent his time elsewhere, doing things the records describe as not particularly productive. He eventually obtained his minor government. Posting the official title was something roughly equivalent to a local constable or village head, responsible for escorting convicts to labour assignments. It was not a prestigious role. It came with a small salary, a degree of local authority, and regular contact with the kind of people that more ambitious officials preferred not to deal with directly. Liu Bang seems to have found it reasonably comfortable. One story that survives from this period, told in the great historian Sima Qian's account, written roughly a century after the events, describes Liu Bang losing a group of convicts he was escorting, releasing the remaining ones rather than face punishment for the losses, and heading into the hills with the men who chose to follow him. Whether this account is precisely accurate in its details is difficult to confirm, but it captures something that every other piece of evidence about Liu Bang supports. He had a quality that made people who had absolutely no obligation to follow him choose to do so anyway. When the rebellions against Qin spread in 209 BC, Liu Bang emerged from his informal position in the hills and began building a proper fighting force. The first significant step came when the local administrator of Pei County, facing the chaos of the rebellion and looking for someone capable of organizing a local response, sent for Liu Bang. The administrator lost his nerve almost immediately after and tried to close the city gates. But Liu Bang had already gathered enough men and enough local support that the gates opened anyway. He was made the Lord of Pei. One of his enduring titles in Chinese history is the Pei Duke, and he began the process of turning a band of followers into something resembling a military organization. What distinguished Liu Bang's approach during these years, compared to other rebel leaders, was something less visible than battlefield tactics. He was collecting people, not just soldiers, but advisors with specific and complementary abilities, men whose combined capabilities could manage the full range of what building a functioning power base actually required. Three figures in particular became essential to what the Han would become, and they are remembered in Chinese history as the three heroes of the early Han. Zhang Liang was a nobleman from the old state of Han, who had originally planned to assassinate Qin Shi Huang himself, and had come close enough to become a fugitive afterward. He became Liu Bang's primary strategic advisor, a man with an extraordinary ability to see political situations from multiple angles simultaneously, and one of the few people in Liu Bang's circle whose advice Liu Bang consistently followed without modification. Xiao. He was an administrative official who understood supply chains, logistics, and the organizational requirements of keeping a large force fed and funded over time. He was, in the most practical sense, the person who made it possible for Liu Bang's armies to remain in the field long enough to matter. Han Xin was a military commander of genuine genius who joined Liu Bang's forces after being overlooked by Xiongnu's camp, and who would eventually be responsible for the strategic campaigns that broke Xiongnu's hold on the north and east. Liu Bang reportedly said, late in his life, that he himself could not claim to be the best strategist, the best administrator, or the best general of his era. What he could do was recognize those qualities in others and make use of them. In a period when most warlords surrounded themselves with men who agreed with them, this instinct was not as common as it sounds. His approach to the Qin heartland also separated him from his rivals in a meaningful way. When his forces moved into the Qin capital region of Guangzhong in 206 BC, arriving before Xiongnu, he issued a set of proclamations that became known informally as the Three Articles of the Law. They were simple and deliberately limited. Killing was prohibited, assault was prohibited, theft was prohibited. Everything else from the massive Qin legal code was suspended. After years of Qin's elaborate and punishing legal system, the effect on the local population was immediate. Communities that might have resisted an approaching army instead received Liu Bang's forces with something close to relief. Xiongnu arrived shortly afterward and took a different approach. His troops sacked Shenyang, executed the last Qin heir, burned the vast Qin palace complex, and seized the treasury. It was the response of a man settling a historical score, and it was enormously satisfying to him personally. What it did for his reputation among the population of the Qin heartland was considerably less positive. The political arrangement that followed was Xiongnu's design. He divided the former Qin territories among the various rebel commanders, assigning Liu Bang to the remote southwestern region of Ba and Shu, essentially a geographic exile wrapped in the nominal title of King of Han. It was meant to sideline him. The assignment reflected Xiongnu's genuine belief that Liu Bang was a manageable secondary figure, which was an assessment that would prove costly. Over the next several years, the Chu-Han contention unfolded across a vast geographic area with shifting momentum. Liu Bang was defeated repeatedly in direct military engagements against Xiongnu. There was a battle at Pengcheng in 205 BC, where Xiongnu's cavalry routed Liu Bang's much larger force in a matter of hours, a defeat so severe that Liu Bang barely escaped with his life, and is said to have abandoned members of his own family in the retreat. He was not winning by outfighting his opponent. What he was doing was grinding. He held territory. He kept his supply lines functioning, largely through Shao, his organizational work in the rear. He let Han Xin run campaigns in the north and east, systematically bringing formerly independent kingdoms under Han control or alliance, gradually encircling Xiongnu's base of power in the Chu region, rather than attacking it frontally. He kept his coalition intact while Xiongnu's, built more on personal loyalty to a single charismatic figure, began fraying under the pressure of a prolonged war. By 203 BC, Xiongnu's position had deteriorated significantly. A negotiated partition of China was briefly arranged, with the Hong Canal as the boundary line, roughly the Qin and Han territories each holding what they had. Liu Bang's advisors immediately recommended breaking the agreement and pressing the advantage before Xiongnu could recover. Liu Bang followed that advice. The final engagement came at Gaozu in 202 BC. Han Xin coordinated a surrounding force from multiple directions, and Xiongnu's army, already depleted and cut off from supplies, found itself encircled. The psychological dimension of the siege involved Han forces singing folk songs from the Chu region on multiple sides of the encampment, a reminder to Xiongnu's soldiers that the territory they had been fighting for was already lost. Whether this was a deliberate tactical calculation or simply the natural behavior of soldiers from that region is something historians have debated, but the effect on morale inside the Chu encampment was severe. Xiongnu broke out with a small force and was pursued to the Wu River, where he reportedly told his remaining followers that heaven had simply decided against him and that no failure of courage or strategy was responsible. Then he died, in the manner that Chinese historical culture has always remembered refusing capture, refusing to cross back to Chu, meeting his end on his own terms if not on his preferred ones. Liu Bang was proclaimed Emperor of Han shortly after, in a ceremony on the banks of the Sai River, attended by the remaining kings and commanders, who now owed him their positions. He was 53 years old, by the traditional Chinese reckoning of age. The Han Dynasty, which would shape China for the next 4 centuries, had its first emperor. What it did not yet have was any clear idea of how to remain stable, a problem that Liu Bang would spend the rest of his life working on, with mixed and sometimes brutal results. Building an empire from rubble. The first thing Emperor Gaozu did after taking the throne was essentially nothing, and this was a deliberate political choice. After more than a decade of civil war, followed by the even longer trauma of Qin rule before that, what most of China needed was not a new set of ambitious state programs. It needed to be left alone long enough to recover. Fields had been abandoned, populations had shifted, whole communities had been displaced by conscription, famine, and the movement of armies. The historical accounts suggest that in some regions, the population had dropped so severely that wolves were reportedly moving back into areas that had been farmland a generation earlier. Whether that specific detail is literally accurate, it captures something real about the state of the country Liu Bang had just won. The philosophical framework that the early Han court leaned on for governing was drawn from a tradition called Huang Lao, a school of thought associated with the legendary Yellow Emperor and with the philosopher Lao Tzu, emphasizing minimal interference, reduced taxation, and the idea that a ruler who acts less tends to achieve more simply by allowing natural recovery processes to operate. It was a philosophy well suited to a government that lacked the administrative capacity to intervene heavily, even if it wanted to, and it provided a useful intellectual justification for restraint that the court could present as wisdom rather than limitation. In practical terms, this translated into a set of policies that were simple and consistent. Taxes on agricultural production were set at 1/15 of the harvest, significantly lower than Qin rates. Conscript labour requirements were reduced. Many of the more punishing elements of the Qin legal code were quietly set aside or never re-implemented. The government stopped demanding the kind of massive infrastructure projects that had driven the population to rebellion in the first place. The message being sent, whether or not it was explicitly articulated, was that the new dynasty was not going to repeat the behaviour of the old one. The capital was established at Chang'an, in the Guangdong region, the same geographical heartland that had anchored Qin power, chosen for its defensive terrain and central administrative position. Construction of the new palace complex proceeded, though at a pace that Gaozu's advisor Xiao He reportedly had to argue for, since Gaozu initially considered the expenditure excessive. Xiao He's position was that a capital city needed to project permanence and authority, and that building something modest would undermine the dynasty's credibility before it had fully established itself. Gaozu accepted the argument, which was characteristic of how he made decisions resistant until the reasoning became clear, then willing to change course. The structural question that Gaozu could not fully resolve, and that would occupy the dynasty for decades after him, was the tension between two fundamentally different models of governance. One model was the centralized bureaucratic state that Qin had perfected, a single administrative hierarchy running from the emperor down to the local level, with appointed officials holding power at every rank, no hereditary kingdoms, no competing loyalties. It was efficient in theory and had proved catastrophically brittle in practice. The other model was the older feudal system that had characterized the warring states period, multiple kingdoms, each with its own ruler, owing nominal allegiance to a central power, but governing their own territories with considerable independence. It was decentralized enough to survive the failure of any single part, but it also meant that central authority was perpetually contested. Gaozu's solution was a compromise that satisfied neither model completely. He established a hybrid system in which the inner core of the empire, the Guangdong heartland, was governed directly through appointed officials on the Qin model. The outer regions were divided into kingdoms and marquisates, ruled by hereditary lords who had varying degrees of autonomy. It was an arrangement that acknowledged the political realities of the moment. Some of the men who had helped him win were too powerful to simply appoint as officials. They had armies. They had popular support in their regions. Giving them kingdoms was a way of incorporating them into the new structure rather than leaving them outside it as potential rivals. The problem was that kings with armies remained kings with armies, and Gaozu was not under any illusions about what that meant long term. His treatment of the men who had most directly contributed to his victory is one of the more unsettling chapters of the early Han period, and historians have noted the pattern with considerable care. Han Xin, the military commander, whose strategic campaigns in the north had effectively won the Chu-Han War, was first reduced from King of Chu to the lesser title of King of Huayin, then accused of plotting rebellion and ultimately executed in 196 BC, reportedly killed on the orders of Empress Lu while Gaozu was away on campaign. Peng Yue, another essential military commander from the war, was also executed on conspiracy charges. Ying Bu, a third major general, actually did rebel when he saw what happened to the others, a fairly rational response to watching colleagues disappear, and was defeated and killed in 196 BC as well. The irony is not subtle. A man who had built his entire rise on the loyalty of capable people spent the final years of his reign systematically removing the most capable people from the board. The reasoning, from a strictly political perspective, was not irrational. These were men who had commanded large armies and governed large territories. They had followings. In a dynasty still finding its footing, any one of them was a potential future Xiongnu, a figure powerful enough to fragment what had just been unified. Gaozu was eliminating not specific threats so much as categories of threat. What he put in their place, after the non-Liu kings had been removed, was a policy that would define Han political structure for generations. The kingdoms would henceforth be held by members of the Liu family, his own sons, brothers, and relatives. The reasoning was that family loyalty provided a more reliable foundation than political obligation. This assumption would be tested repeatedly in the decades that followed, and it would not always hold, but it remained the organizing principle of Han territorial governance for a long time. One external challenge during Gaozu's reign was more humbling than anything he faced domestically. The Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples north of the Great Wall, mounted and militarily sophisticated, had consolidated their own power under a leader called Modu Chanyu at roughly the same time that China was tearing itself apart in civil war. By the time Gaozu had stabilized the Han interior, the Xiongnu represented a serious and ongoing pressure on the northern frontier. In 200 BC, Gaozu led a military expedition north against the Xiongnu, and it went badly. He was surrounded with a portion of his army at a place called Baideng Mountain for roughly 7 days before a negotiated escape was arranged, the details of which the historical sources handle with some delicacy, since they appear to have involved considerable gifts to the Xiongnu leadership. It was not the kind of military outcome that an emperor wanted attached to his personal record. The policy that followed, known as Heqin, meaning something like harmonious kinship, involved sending Chinese princesses to marry Xiongnu leaders, accompanied by substantial gifts of silk, grain, and other goods. It was effectively a payment for peace dressed in diplomatic language. The Han court understood it as a temporary arrangement born of military necessity. The Xiongnu leadership accepted it with the straightforward practicality of people who had just demonstrated what happened when that arrangement was not maintained. This policy would persist under several Han emperors before anyone felt capable of revisiting it. Gaozu spent his last years dealing with a rebellion from one of the remaining heteronymous kings, managing a court that was already developing its own internal factions, and reportedly suffering from wounds sustained during one of his military campaigns. He died in 195 BC, in his early 60s, having been emperor for roughly 7 years. What he left behind was imperfect in almost every specific way, and significant in its overall shape. He had established that the Han Dynasty existed. He had set a governing tone light on the peasantry, pragmatic about power, willing to negotiate where fighting was too costly that the dynasty would more or less maintain for the next several decades. He had created a structure of Liu family kingdoms that would cause future problems, but would also hold the empire together through periods that might otherwise have fragmented it. He had also, not entirely intentionally, left the court in a condition where the next powerful figure waiting to take control was not one of his sons, but his wife. And Empress Lu had been watching, planning, and positioning herself for quite some time, the woman who ran the empire. Empress Lu had been married to Liu Bang before he was anyone in particular. She had come from a family of modest means in the same region, and her father, by the kind of social maneuvering that small communities occasionally produced, had arranged the match when Liu Bang was still a minor local official with nothing especially promising about his future. She ran the household. She managed the farm. When Liu Bang was away, which became increasingly frequent as the rebellion spread, she raised their children and handled everything that needed handling, including at one point being captured by Xiongnu's forces and held for roughly 2 years as a political hostage. She survived that experience and returned to Liu Bang's camp without any visible sign that it had diminished her. By the time Liu Bang became emperor, Empress Liu had developed a very thorough understanding of what political power was, how it was held, and what it cost to lose it. She had watched her husband build his authority carefully over years. She had been present during the period when the non-Liu kings were removed. She understood court dynamics with a precision that came not from formal training, but from sustained close observation of people who were playing for everything. When Gaozu died in 195 BC, his son by Empress Liu, the young man who took the throne as Emperor Hui, was in his mid-teens. He was, by most historical accounts, a gentle and somewhat fragile personality, unsuited temperamentally for the pressures of imperial rule and not especially eager for them. Empress Liu became the dominant force in the court almost immediately, operating initially as Empress Dowager rather than regent in any formal sense, but making the decisions that mattered in practice. The first significant thing she did in the period after Gaozu's death was also the act most recorded in Chinese historical memory, and it says something direct about how she understood power. During the later years of Gaozu's reign, his favoured concubine had been a woman named Lady Qi, who had borne him a son called Ru Yi. Gaozu had at various points considered replacing Empress Liu's son as crown prince with Ru Yi, and Empress Liu had spent considerable effort ensuring that this did not happen. The political battle over the succession had been real, sustained, and personal. After Gaozu's death, Empress Liu had Lady Qi confined and had the young Prince Ru Yi summoned to the capital. Emperor Hui, aware of what was likely intended, kept Ru Yi close and refused for a period to allow him out of his sight. But on a morning when the young emperor had gone out early to practice archery, and Ru Yi was still asleep, Empress Liu had the prince poisoned. Lady Qi was then subjected to a punishment that the historical sources describe with clinical specificity. Her limbs were amputated, her senses removed one by one, and she was placed in what Empress Liu reportedly called the human swine. Emperor Hui, when he was shown what had been done, reportedly could not recover from it emotionally and spent the remainder of his reign increasingly withdrawn from court affairs, leaving governance more completely to his mother than he might otherwise have done. He died in 188 BC, not yet 20 years old, and the historical accounts suggest that what he had witnessed contributed meaningfully to the deterioration of his health. Whether Empress Liu intended this outcome, the neutralization of her own son as a governing force, is a matter of interpretation. It is possible she simply acted on personal grievances without calculating the political consequence. It is equally possible that a court entirely dependent on her own judgment suited her purposes very well. The evidence does not definitively resolve the question, but the effect was the same either way. After Emperor Hui's death, Empress Liu governed through a series of child emperors whose parentage and legitimacy were themselves uncertain. The historical record on these years is complicated by the fact that much of what survives was written after her death, by people with strong political reasons to portray her negatively. What is reasonably clear is that she was the functional ruler of the Han Empire from approximately 195 BC until her death in 180 BC, a period of roughly 15 years. That is not an inconsiderable reign, measured against the reigns of actual emperors in the same dynasty. Her governing style continued the light-touch approach established under Gaozu. Taxes remained low. The Huanglao philosophy of minimal interference stayed in place at the administrative level. Whatever her personal brutality in court politics, she did not disrupt the recovery the empire was undergoing. and the Han state continued to grow stronger economically during her years in power. This is one of the more complicated aspects of her historical legacy. The acts most associated with her name were intensely personal and violent, while her actual governing record was, by the standards of the era, functional and even competent. Where she overreached was in her treatment of the structural rules Gaozu had established. The White Horse Oath, the agreement that only members of the Liu family could hold the title of king, had been a foundational principle of Han territorial organization. Empress Liu began appointing members of her own Liu family to kingly titles and positions of military command. She was not, technically speaking, a Liu, and the senior ministers who had served through the founding generation understood exactly what this meant. It was the first serious attempt to redirect the dynasty's hereditary line. The ministers in question, figures like Chen Ping, who had been one of Gaozu's most reliable advisors, and Zhou Bo, who commanded significant military loyalty, did not openly resist during Empress Liu's lifetime. They were experienced enough to know that direct opposition to a functioning regent in control of the capital was not a survivable choice. Instead, they waited. The patience required for this was considerable, and it is worth noting that Chen Ping had survived the courts of both Xiongnu and Liu Bang, which suggests he had developed a fairly sophisticated relationship with patience by this point. Empress Liu died in 180 BC, reportedly after being injured by something during a royal hunt. The sources are not entirely consistent on the specifics, which is itself worth noting. Within weeks of her death, the senior ministers moved. They coordinated the arrest and execution of the leading members of the Liu family, who had been placed in positions of military and administrative authority, moving quickly enough to prevent any organized response. The child emperor on the throne at the time of Empress Liu's death was removed on the grounds that his parentage was questionable, a claim that the ministers asserted with confidence because they were the ones in a position to assert it. In his place, they elevated Liu Heng, a surviving son of Gaozu, who had been governing a remote northern kingdom called Dai, far from the centre of court politics for most of his adult life. He was in his mid-20s, had no particular enemies among the court factions, and had spent enough years away from the capital that no one had developed serious grievances against him. He was, in other words, exactly what the senior ministers needed in that particular moment, someone legitimate, manageable, and not already committed to any of the competing factions that had just dismantled the Liu family's power. He would become Emperor Wen, and he would turn out to be rather more than anyone had initially bargained for. The episode surrounding Empress Liu's regency is often treated in Chinese historical writing as a cautionary story about female ambition, about the dangers of allowing non-Liu control of the court, about what happens when the rules Gaozu established are set aside. There is some justice in that reading, but it misses something. What the period actually demonstrated was that the Han system, even at its most stressed, a teenage emperor psychologically broken by his mother's actions, a court ruled by a woman who had not been designated to rule it, a succession of child emperors of uncertain legitimacy was durable enough to survive. The senior ministers held, the administrative structure held, the population continued farming, paying modest taxes and recovering from decades of war. The dynasty bent sharply during these years, but it did not break. That resilience was, in its own way, a testament to what Gaozu had actually built. Not a system dependent on the quality of any individual ruler, but a set of institutions and habits stable enough to outlast its most difficult occupants. The quiet decades that fed a dynasty. Emperor Wen arrived in Chang'an from his northern kingdom of Dai in 180 BC with a degree of caution entirely appropriate to his situation. He had been selected by a committee of powerful ministers who had just finished eliminating an entire rival family from the court, and he was perceptive enough to understand that the men who had invited him to the throne had done so with their own interests in mind alongside his. He entered the capital carefully, confirmed his key appointments thoughtfully, and spent the first months of his reign doing nothing that would give anyone reason to be alarmed. Then he started governing, and what emerged over the following years turned out to be one of the more genuinely effective stretches of Chinese imperial rule in the entire dynastic period. Emperor Wen was, by all the accounts that survive him, a man who actually believed in what he was doing rather than performing it for the court's benefit. The Huanglao philosophy of light governance had been a useful justification for the early Han's administrative limitations. Under Emperor Wen, it became something closer to personal conviction. He reduced agricultural taxes to 1/30th of the harvest, already significantly lower than the Qin rate that had helped produce rebellion, and during certain prosperous periods suspended the land tax entirely for stretches of time. He reduced the number of required corvée labour days that commoners owed the state each year. He undertook a significant reform of the criminal code, removing several categories of mutilation punishment that had persisted from the Qin system, replacing them with flogging, which, by the standards of the era, represented a meaningful reduction in the severity of state violence against ordinary people. His personal frugality was the subject of considerable court comment, and it is one of those details that historians tend to return to because it seems almost implausibly consistent. He reportedly wore the same coarse silk robes for years, rather than commissioning new ones. When a proposal was made to build a terrace at the palace, he had the cost calculated, to was told it equalled the total wealth of 10 middle-class households, and declined to proceed. His favourite concubine was instructed not to let her robes trail on the ground, apparently because fabric touching the floor was wasteful. The court, observing all this, adjusted its own public behaviour to match, which meant that the culture of imperial display that had characterised other dynasties was, during these years, conspicuously absent from the Han capital. Whether this frugality was entirely genuine or partly theatrical is a question that historians have handled with appropriate care. The most honest answer is probably that it was both that Emperor Wen's personal temperament genuinely ran towards simplicity, and that he was also aware of the political value of being seen to live that way after the years of Empress Lu's more assertive court. A ruler who conspicuously consumes less than he could generates a different kind of loyalty than one who consumes everything available. The practical results of these years accumulated quietly but significantly. Granaries that had been depleted by years of war and instability gradually filled. The historical sources describe storage facilities so packed by the later years of Emperor Wen's reign that the ropes used to string coins together rotted from disuse, the coins themselves sitting undisturbed long enough that the cords holding them decayed before anyone needed to spend them. That particular detail has the quality of an official historian making a point, rather than a census record. But the underlying reality it reflects a treasury moving from stressed to comfortable is supported by other evidence. The population grew. Agricultural land under cultivation expanded as former refugees and displaced communities returned to farming. Trade along internal routes recovered and extended. The Han state, which had been exhausted and uncertain at its founding, was beginning to look like something durable. There was one thinker during Emperor Wen's reign whose work cut against the general mood of quiet confidence, and whose arguments would prove, in retrospect, to have been well aimed. Jia Yi was a scholar and official who rose to prominence in his early 20s, young enough that some senior ministers resented his influence and eventually arranged his reassignment to a distant posting, and who wrote a series of memorials to Emperor Wen that dealt with the structural vulnerabilities of the Han system. His primary concern was the feudal kingdoms. The Liu family kings, who held the outer territories of the empire, had, over the years since Gaozu, been accumulating power and passing it to their sons, who passed it to their sons while the central government's direct control extended only to its core territories. Jia Yi argued that this was a slow-building problem, that each generation of regional kings would be slightly more distant from their loyalty to the throne, slightly more entrenched in their local power, slightly more capable of challenging the center if they chose to. His recommendation was to begin gradually subdividing the kingdoms, giving portions to multiple heirs rather than passing them intact to a single successor, thereby reducing their size and power over time. Emperor Wen listened to these arguments, agreed with them in principle, and largely did not act on them during his own reign. The kingdoms were still governed by men he knew personally, men who had been children or young adults when Gaozu was alive. The problem felt theoretical. This was not an unusual response to a problem that had not yet declared itself clearly, but it did mean that the structural vulnerability Jie Yi had identified remained in place when Emperor Wen died in 157 BC, and his son took the throne as Emperor Jing. Emperor Jing was a more assertive personality than his father, with less of the elder man's instinct for patience and a sharper edge in his political judgments. He inherited a prosperous, stable empire and a set of unresolved structural tensions. He also had an advisor named Cao Kuo, who had been making the same arguments as Jia Yi that the kingdoms needed to be reduced, and who had considerably less of Jia Yi's diplomatic subtlety about the pace at which this should be done. Cao Kuo persuaded Emperor Jing to begin directly reducing the territorial holdings of several regional kings, citing various administrative grievances as justification. The kings in question understood what was happening and responded in 154 BC with a coordinated military rebellion. 7 kingdoms rose simultaneously. It came to be known as the Rebellion of the Seven Kingdoms, and for a brief period it appeared that the structural fracture Jie Yi had warned about was arriving all at once. The rebellion lasted roughly 3 months. This outcome surprised many people at the time and has interested historians ever since. The central government's military, drawing on the accumulated resources of nearly 3 decades of relative peace and economic growth, was in substantially better condition than the rebel kingdoms had apparently calculated. The commanding general Zhou Yafu, son of the Zhou Bo, who had helped restore Liu family rule after Empress Liu's death, conducted the suppression with a strategic patience that involved cutting the rebels' supply lines, rather than meeting them frontally, allowing the rebellion to exhaust itself before delivering the finishing engagements. It was effective and relatively swift. The political aftermath was more significant than the military campaign. The surviving regional kings were allowed to keep their titles in most cases, but the territories they governed were reduced. Crucially, the right to appoint their own officials was removed. The central government would henceforth send its own administrators into the kingdoms, meaning that the kings became largely ceremonial figures with diminishing practical authority. The process Jie Yi had recommended, the gradual reduction of feudal power in favour of centralised control, was accelerated by the rebellion into something much faster and more complete. By the time Emperor Jing died in 141 BC, the Han Empire had changed shape in a way that could not have been easily predicted at its founding. The outer kingdoms still existed, but they were increasingly hollow structures, titles without the military and administrative substance that made them genuinely dangerous. The resources of a unified empire, the tax revenues, the population, the agricultural surplus of those long, frugal decades were now concentrated in the centre, in a way they had not been under Gaozu or Emperor Wen. This concentration of resources was about to become very important. The next emperor to take the throne had large plans for all of it. The emperor who wanted everything. There is a particular kind of ruler who inherits a stable, well-provisioned empire and immediately begins spending it. Emperor Wu, born Liu Che, who took the throne in 141 BC at around 16 years of age, was that kind of ruler, and the Han Dynasty was lucky that it had spent the previous 6 decades building exactly the kind of reserves that could absorb what he intended to do with them. His reign lasted 54 years. That alone places him in a category that most dynasties never produce. 54 years is long enough to reshape institutions, long enough to outlast your critics, long enough to begin several projects that your successors will have to finish or abandon, and long enough, as Emperor Wu discovered, to make serious mistakes and then live with their consequences for decades. He was China's longest reigning Han emperor, and by almost any measure its most consequential. The contrast with his father and grandfather was immediate and total. Emperors Wen and Jing had governed on the principle that the state should take as little as possible from the population and intervene in its affairs as rarely as necessary. Emperor Wu governed on the principle that China was an empire with a destiny, and that destiny was not going to realize itself through restraint and frugality. The granaries and treasuries that had been carefully filled over 30 years were, in his view, instruments waiting to be used. He began early. Within the first years of his reign, he was already reorganizing the court's intellectual foundations, moving decisively away from the Huang-Lao philosophy that had defined Han governance since the beginning. Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy, ritual education, and the cultivation of virtuous officials, suited his vision of empire far better than a philosophy advising the ruler to do less. He would formalize this shift in ways that transformed the entire administrative structure of the dynasty. But even before the formal changes were made, the tone of his court had shifted clearly toward a more activist model of imperial governance. He also started moving militarily, and here the scale of his ambition becomes genuinely difficult to summarize without distorting it. Emperor Wu fought wars on virtually every frontier of the Han Empire during his reign, not sequentially but often simultaneously. In the north, he launched the largest sustained military campaign against the Xiongnu that China had yet attempted, abandoning the Qin payment policy his predecessors had maintained, and replacing it with direct military confrontation. In the south, he absorbed the independent Yue kingdom's territories in what is now Guangdong, Guangxi, and Vietnam into the Han administrative system. In the northeast, he pushed into the Korean peninsula, establishing commanderies in what is now northern Korea. In the west, he sent expeditions deep into Central Asia, establishing contact with distant kingdoms and beginning the process that would eventually be called the Silk Road. The generals who made the northern campaigns possible are among the better documented military figures of the entire Han period. Wei Qing was a former stable hand who had risen through imperial household connections. He was the brother of one of Emperor Wu's favoured consorts, and who turned out to possess a genuine talent for the kind of mobile, large-scale cavalry operations that Xiongnu warfare required. He won significant engagements in 127 BC and again in 119 BC, pushing the Xiongnu back beyond the Gobi and recovering territories that had been beyond Han reach for generations. Hua Qubing was Wei Qing's nephew and, by the historical accounts, an even more instinctively gifted commander. He launched deep strikes into Xiongnu territory that went further and faster than anything Han armies had attempted, operating in ways that apparently surprised even the Xiongnu, who were accustomed to being the faster and more mobile force in any engagement. Hua Qubing died young in 117 BC, probably in his mid-20s, before anyone could fully assess what his career might have produced, which is one of those historical losses that leaves a clean edge of unknowability. What all of this cost is the other side of Emperor Wu's reign, and it is not a minor consideration. The treasury that had accumulated over decades of careful governance was not inexhaustible, and Emperor Wu was testing its limits simultaneously across multiple frontiers. Military campaigns of the scale he was running, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, operating at enormous distances from the capital, requiring supply chains that stretched across deserts and mountain ranges, consumed resources at a rate that the early Han's frugal governance had never approached. To manage this, Emperor Wu turned to a set of fiscal innovations that his predecessors would have found deeply uncomfortable. He placed the production of salt and iron, the two commodities that every farming household needed and could not produce for itself under state monopoly. The profits flowed directly to the imperial treasury. He implemented a property tax targeting merchants who had been largely left alone under earlier Han policies. He introduced a system of selling official titles and ranks, allowing wealthy families to purchase a degree of status recognition that had previously been theoretically reserved for those who had earned it through service. He debased the currency at one point, issuing new coinage with different metal content, with predictable effects on economic stability. The official and most closely associated with these financial schemes was Yang, a former merchant's son who became Emperor Wu's primary economic administrator and who had a systematic mind for extracting revenue from economic activity. He was effective by the standards of what he was being asked to do, which was to fund an empire operating beyond its natural means. He was also deeply unpopular with the Confucian scholar class, who viewed commerce as an inherently undignified basis for state revenue, and who would spend years after Emperor Wu's death relitigating his policies in a famous public debate. Emperor Wu's personal character added dimensions to his reign that pure policy analysis tends to underweight. He was genuinely intellectually curious. He engaged with scholars, took philosophical arguments seriously, and was not simply performing interest in ideas. He was also capable of considerable cruelty toward people who disappointed him or fell out of his favour, including several advisors who had served him well and came to unfortunate ends through court dynamics rather than any genuine failure. He went through favourites with a regularity that made the position of imperial favourite something that thoughtful people might reasonably have wanted to avoid. He also developed, as he aged, an intense preoccupation with finding some means of extending his life indefinitely. He funded the activities of various practitioners who claimed knowledge of immortality techniques, received their reports with apparent seriousness, and sent at least one famous expedition out into the eastern seas to find islands that were rumoured to be the home of immortal beings. The expedition returned without immortals, which should perhaps have been predictable, but did not substantially reduce his interest in the subject. Somewhere between the man who reshaped a continent and the man who kept sending boats out looking for the island of eternal life, the full picture of Emperor Wu begins to take shape. What he built during his 54 years was an empire considerably larger, more culturally unified, and more institutionally sophisticated than the one he had inherited. What he cost the dynasty in resources, in financial distortions, and in the administrative tensions his policies created would take his successors years to address. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The reach of his ambitions had already, by the middle of his reign, extended further west than any Han emperor before him, into territories and trade networks that connected China to the rest of the known world in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. That story deserves its own account. The road that changed the world. The Silk Road was not built. It was not planned, surveyed, or constructed by any government with a unified vision of what it was creating. It grew incrementally, haphazardly, through a combination of military necessity, diplomatic ambition, commercial opportunism, and occasional accident into a network of routes that eventually connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and the edges of the Mediterranean world. The name itself came much later. A German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen applied it in the 1800s, nearly 2,000 years after the routes were already carrying traffic. The people who actually travelled them in the Han period had no single word for what they were doing, beyond going somewhere difficult to reach and hoping to come back. The origin of the Han Dynasty's westward reach begins with a diplomat named Zhang, and his story is worth following in some detail because it contains essentially everything. The Silk Road would eventually come to represent ambition, endurance, unexpected discovery, and the peculiar way that a mission can fail at its stated purpose and succeed at something more important. In 139 BC, Emperor Wu dispatched Zhang westward with a party of roughly 100 men. The mission was military-diplomatic rather than commercial. Emperor Wu wanted to make contact with a people called the Yuezhi, who had been driven westward from their original territory by the Xiongnu and who, the Han court reasoned, might be persuaded to form an alliance against their mutual enemy from the other side. Zhang was to find them, propose the alliance, and return with a commitment. He did not manage any of this on the schedule anyone had envisioned, because shortly after crossing the Han frontier, his party was captured by the Xiongnu. They were held for approximately 10 years, Zhang Qian was given a Xiongnu wife, fathered children, and lived in the captivity of a nomadic culture about which very little had previously been recorded from a Chinese perspective. He eventually escaped with a small group, continued westward, which requires a certain kind of specific personality, and reached the Yuezhi, who had settled into agricultural life in Bactria and had, in the intervening years, lost most of their interest in fighting the Xiongnu. The alliance proposal went nowhere. Zhang Qian turned around, was captured by the Xiongnu again on the way home, escaped again after roughly a year, and finally returned to Chang'an in 126 BC, 13 years after he had left. With 2 members of his original party of 100, and without the alliance he had been sent to create. Emperor Wu awarded him a title anyway, because what Zhang Qian brought back was more valuable than a military alliance. He brought back information. He had travelled through Fergana, a region famous for its horses, which were larger and more powerful than anything the Han armies were working with. He had reached Bactria, the former eastern edge of Alexander the Great's empire, where Greek cultural influences were still visible in the architecture and coinage. He had gathered reports of Parthia, of India, of a distant western empire that the Chinese sources called Dakin, almost certainly referring to Rome, which apparently traded in fine goods and had a population as large as China's own. He came back having seen with his own eyes that China was not the only large and sophisticated civilization in the world, and that there were routes connecting them. Emperor Wu sent Zhang Qian west again in 119 BC, this time with a much larger party, and gifts tens of thousands of cattle and sheep, substantial quantities of silk and gold to distribute among the kingdoms he visited. This second mission established actual diplomatic contact with several Central Asian states, and set in motion the pattern of exchange that would define the routes for the next several centuries. What came to be called the Silk Road was never a single path. It was a branching system of routes running generally east to west, with a northern branch and a southern branch that skirted the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, a body of sand large enough and hostile enough that no one crossed its centre willingly, meeting at oasis cities like Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Samarkand. These oases were not merely rest stops. They were trading hubs, cultural crossroads, and eventually substantial cities in their own right, each developing its own character from the mixing of travellers and merchants and pilgrims passing through over generations. The Han government understood early that maintaining safe passage along these routes required military presence. A series of garrison towns and watchtower chains extended westward from the Jade Gate, the Yumen Pass, in what is now Gansu province, which served as the symbolic western boundary of Han China proper. Soldiers stationed in these remote posts lived in conditions that the historical sources suggest were not particularly appealing. Monitoring the roads, relaying signals, and occasionally fighting off raids from nomadic groups who viewed the caravans as moving supply depots. What travelled along these routes in the Han period was more varied than the name suggests, though silk was genuinely among the most significant exports. Chinese silk was extraordinarily valued in the Western markets. Its production technique was a closely guarded secret, and the finished fabric was light, strong, and unlike anything that Mediterranean or Central Asian weavers could produce. Silk moved west in enormous quantities, carried by merchants who were technically near the bottom of the Han social hierarchy, but who were, in practice, generating enough wealth to complicate that official designation. Moving east along the same routes came horses, most importantly, the horses of Fergana. Emperor Wu developed what can only be described as an intense personal investment in obtaining these animals. They were called heavenly horses, or blood-sweating horses, a description that appears to have referred to a parasitic infection that caused skin lesions, though the Han court interpreted it as evidence of a supernatural origin, which is one of those historical misunderstandings that tells you something useful about both parties involved. Emperor Wu wanted these horses badly enough that when an initial diplomatic mission to Fergana came back empty-handed after the local king declined to trade them, he sent an army. The first army was defeated. He sent a larger army. Fergana eventually agreed to provide the horses. Glass came east as well. Roman and Parthian glassware was exotic and valued in China, where the technology for producing it had not yet developed. Cotton textiles, exotic animals, new foods, and medical knowledge moved in both directions. But the most consequential thing that travelled the Silk Road into China was not a physical object at all. Buddhism, originating in the Indian subcontinent and already well established in Central Asian communities by the 1st century BC, began entering China through the western corridors, opened by Zhang Qian's journeys and the subsequent traffic. Its arrival would be slow, initially marginal, and eventually transformative in ways that no Han emperor anticipated or planned for. The human texture of the Silk Road was made up of people who rarely appear by name in the official histories. Sogdian merchants from a Central Asian culture centered roughly in modern Uzbekistan became the primary professional traders along the routes, running networks of family-based commercial operations that stretched from China to Persia. Monks carried manuscripts, musicians carried instruments. Artists absorbed visual influences from cultures they had never heard of before arriving. A jade carving found in a Han tomb might contain stone mined in the Kunlun Mountains. A bronze mirror might show stylistic influences from Iran. A ceramic figure might wear the clothing of a Central Asian horseman. The physical objects that survive from this period carry the roots inside them. The Han government's official attitude toward merchants remained ambivalent throughout all of this. They were socially ranked below farmers in the Confucian hierarchy, people who profited from others' production rather than producing anything themselves, and were subject to sumptuary laws restricting their dress and limiting their ability to purchase certain goods or titles. That many of them were substantially wealthier than the officials passing these restrictions is one of those comfortable ironies that Han society managed to sustain for quite some time. What the roots created, over the course of Emperor Wu's reign and beyond, was a China increasingly aware of its own position in a larger world, not isolated, not self-contained, but connected outward by threads of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that no single power fully controlled. That awareness would gradually change what China made, what it believed, and how it imagined itself. The idea that ran the government. Confucius was born in 551 BC, in the small state of Lu in eastern China, into a family of minor nobility that had lost most of its wealth by the time he arrived. He spent much of his adult life trying to find a ruler willing to implement his ideas about governance, travelling from state to state with a group of students, offering his services as an advisor, and being consistently declined or dismissed. He died in 479 BC without having held significant political power anywhere. He was, by his own account near the end of his life, a failure. The fact that his ideas would eventually become the official philosophical foundation of the largest empire on earth and remain the organizing intellectual framework of Chinese civilization for roughly 2,000 years would have surprised him considerably. It would also have satisfied him enormously, which is perhaps the more telling point about the man. What Confucius taught was not a religion in any conventional sense, though it developed over centuries into something with religious dimensions. It was fundamentally a set of ideas about how human beings should relate to each other, how society should be organized, and what qualities made a person, and by extension a ruler, an official, or a state genuinely good rather than merely powerful. The core of his thinking was built around a set of relationships. He identified 5 relationships as the foundation of all social order, between ruler and subject, between father and son, between husband and wife, between elder brother and younger brother, and between friend and friend. Each relationship carried mutual obligations. The ruler owed benevolent governance to the subject, who owed loyalty in return. The father owed guidance and provision to the son, who owed filial piety in return. The relationships were not equal in their terms, but they were not one-directional either. Even the ruler had obligations, and a ruler who failed to meet them was, in Confucian thinking, no longer truly a ruler in any meaningful sense. Filial piety, the deep respect and care owed to parents and ancestors, was the virtue Confucianism placed above almost everything else. It was the foundation on which all other social virtues were built. A person who genuinely honoured and cared for their parents was considered reliably capable of loyalty, of proper conduct in official roles, and of treating others in the community with appropriate consideration. The logic was that the habits of relationship formed in the family were the training ground for all other social relationships, and that a society built on filial piety was self-regulating in ways that required far less external enforcement. Education was essential to the Confucian program in a very specific way. Virtuous conduct was not simply innate, it was cultivated through study of the classical texts, through ritual practice, through the sustained effort to understand and internalize the models of behavior that the ancient sages had demonstrated. This emphasis on education as the path to virtuous governance is what made Confucianism so naturally compatible with the needs of a large bureaucratic empire. A state that wanted educated, reliable officials who governed according to consistent principles had in Confucianism a ready-made curriculum and a philosophical justification for why education mattered. The early Han had not adopted Confucianism for reasons that were largely practical rather than philosophical. Wang Lao, thinking with its emphasis on minimal intervention and natural recovery, had suited a dynasty in the process of stabilizing after decades of war. Several of Emperor Gaozu's early advisors had also been openly skeptical of Confucian scholars, viewing them as impractical men more interested in ritual correctness than in the actual work of governance. There is a story about Gaozu himself that the historical sources preserve with evident amusement. He reportedly once grabbed a scholar's Confucian ceremonial hat and urinated in it to make a point about the practical uselessness of ceremony. Whether this is literally accurate is uncertain, but it captures something real about the early Han court's relationship with formal scholarship. The shift came under Emperor Wu, and the person most responsible for articulating the case for it was a scholar named Dong Zhongshu. He was a Confucian thinker of considerable systematic ambition who had spent years developing a comprehensive theory of how heaven, the natural order, and human governance related to each other. His argument to Emperor Wu, delivered in a series of memorials, was essentially that the empire needed a unified intellectual foundation. The early Han had allowed many different philosophical schools to coexist: Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, the school of names, various cosmological traditions, and while this pluralism had been intellectually lively, it produced no consistent principles for training officials or evaluating their conduct. Dong Zhongshu proposed that Confucianism be elevated to the position of official state philosophy, that the other schools be removed from the official curriculum, and that a single standardized body of texts become the foundation for government education and official selection. Emperor Wu accepted this framework, and in 136 BC issued decrees establishing Confucianism as the basis of the state's intellectual life. The other philosophical schools were not banned. They continued to be studied privately and the ideas circulated, but they were officially sidelined from the machinery of government. The institutional expression of this decision came in 124 BC, with the establishment of the Taixue, the Imperial Academy. It was initially a modest institution with 50 students chosen from across the empire based on recommendations from officials and scholars who studied the 5 classics under appointed academicians. The 5 classics were the foundational Confucian texts: the Book of Changes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Songs, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Mastery of these texts became the formal requirement for entry into the official class. The Taixue grew steadily. By the later Han period, it would have thousands of students, and the principle it established that government office should be connected to demonstrated mastery of a specific body of learning, tested through some formal process, laid the intellectual groundwork for what would eventually become the Chinese imperial examination system. The fully developed examination system came much later, but its origins are traceable to the choices made under Emperor Wu and the Confucian framework Dong Zhongshu had articulated. What this produced over time was a governing class with shared texts, shared vocabulary, shared assumptions about what good governance looked like, and shared habits of argumentation. When an official in a distant province wrote a memorial to the court, both he and the court ministers reading it were working within the same intellectual framework, referring to the same historical precedents, the same classical passages, the same definitions of virtue and governance. This common language made a large, geographically dispersed empire considerably more administratively coherent than it could have been otherwise. The practical gap between Confucian ideals and actual governmental conduct was, naturally, wide and persistent. The classical texts described a world of virtuous rulers, morally exemplary officials, and properly ordered social relationships. The actual Han court contained factionalism, corruption, favoritism, and officials who had memorized the 5 classics thoroughly enough to cite them in support of whatever position was currently convenient. A scholar who could quote the Book of Rights on the proper conduct of a minister did not thereby become a proper minister, and everyone involved understood this. But the framework mattered anyway, because it provided a shared standard, a set of criteria for what good governance should look like against which actual behavior could be measured and criticized. The effect on ordinary social life was perhaps even more pervasive than the effect on official culture. Confucian values about family structure, about respect for elders, about the proper conduct of mourning and marriage, and daily interaction filtered downward from the official class into the broader population over generations. Not uniformly, not instantly, and certainly not without considerable adaptation to local conditions, but consistently enough that by the middle and later Han period, Confucian social norms had become deeply embedded in the texture of Chinese life in ways that would outlast the dynasty itself by a very long distance. The idea that had been walking from state to state in the company of a small group of students in the 5th century BC had found, several hundred years later, an empire large enough to contain it, how people actually lived. To understand what the Han Dynasty actually was beyond its emperors, its wars, and its philosophical debates, it helps to set aside the palace for a moment and think about the village. The overwhelming majority of the roughly 60 million people living inside the Han Empire at its height were farmers. They grew the food, paid the taxes, served the conscript labour requirements, and provided the soldiers when the armies needed filling. Everything the dynasty accomplished, the roads, the walls, the campaigns, the academies, rested on what they produced. The Confucian social hierarchy placed them second in the official ranking of occupations, just below the scholar officials and above artisans and merchants. In practice, this meant that farming carried a degree of cultural prestige that bears almost no resemblance to the actual conditions of the people doing it. A farmer at the height of the Han Dynasty lived in a rectangular single-story structure of rammed earth or mud brick, with a thatched or tile roof depending on the region's prosperity, typically organised around a small courtyard shared with the household's animals. Pigs were kept close. They were the primary meat source and required almost no separate feeding, being content with food scraps and whatever else was available. Chickens occupied the same general space. The smell was probably not subtle. The diet in northern China centred on millet and wheat. Millet was the older staple hardy, drought-resistant, easily stored, and had been the foundation of Chinese agriculture for thousands of years before the Han. Wheat was spreading during this period, increasingly made into noodles or steamed breads rather than the porridges that earlier Chinese cooking had favoured. In the south, rice was the primary grain. Vegetables like turnips, leeks, garlic, and various greens rounded out the diet, usually fermented or dried for preservation. Soybeans were processed into paste, an early ancestor of later fermented products that would become central to East Asian cuisine. Pork was the dominant meat across all regions, consumed at festivals, at ceremonial occasions, and whenever the household pig reached the appropriate moment in its life cycle. Clothing for farming families was made from hemp, a plant that could be grown, processed, and woven within the community without access to any specialized trade network. Hemp fabric was durable, rough, and entirely adequate for physical labor in fields. It was also a reliable visual marker of social position that could be read from a distance, which in Han society was precisely the point. Silk was for the upper classes. The distinction between who wore silk and who wore hemp was enforced not only by economics but by sumptuary law, official regulations, governing what different social classes were permitted to wear, drive, or display. The scholar officials who administered the empire occupied a different material world entirely. Their robes were silk, and the specific colours and patterns they were permitted to wear varied according to their rank within the bureaucratic hierarchy. Official dress was regulated in considerable detail. The width of a sash, the colour of a robe's trim, the style of a ceremonial cap were all indicators of position that an educated observer could read immediately. High officials lived in courtyard compounds of multiple, interconnected buildings, furnished with lacquerware, the distinctively Han combination of wood coated in layers of lacquer to produce objects of remarkable lightness and beauty. Bronze vessels, silk hangings, and the general material culture of a literate, prosperous household. Their diet reflected this prosperity. The wealthy ate more frequently, more variously, and with considerably more ceremony than the farming population. Meat appeared regularly, rather than occasionally. Wine, a grain-based fermented drink, rather than the grape variety, accompanied formal meals and social gatherings. The formal banquet was a significant social institution, with specific dishes appropriate to specific occasions, a prescribed order of service, and seating arrangements that reflected the social relationships among the guests. Getting the seating arrangement wrong at a formal dinner was not a minor oversight in Han culture. It was a statement about how you understood the hierarchy of the room, and people noticed. A remarkable amount of what we know about Han material life comes from tombs, because the Han practice of providing the dead with the goods they had used in life means that the archaeological record contains extraordinary detail about objects that would otherwise have rotted or disappeared. The tomb of a noblewoman discovered near Changsha in the 1970s, preserved through some combination of burial conditions and exceptionally careful craftsmanship, contained silk garments in near-perfect condition, lacquerware sets, food items including fruits and grains, manuscripts of texts, and the woman herself, preserved well enough that her last meal could be identified. She had apparently enjoyed a fairly comfortable diet right up to the end. The silk found in that tomb was woven to a fineness that modern machinery would struggle to replicate, which gives you some sense of what the textile industry was producing at the Han peak. Artisans occupied the third tier of the official hierarchy, and their work was embedded in every aspect of Han life. Bronze casting had been a Chinese specialty for centuries before the Han, and Han bronzersmiths continued the tradition in vessels, mirrors, lamps, and fittings of considerable technical sophistication. Lacquerware production required specialized workshops with multiple skilled workers, each handling a different stage of the layering process. A single high-quality lacquer piece might involve dozens of applications over months. Ceramics were produced in regional styles across the empire, with certain areas developing particular reputations for specific types of ware. Then there were the merchants, who were officially last in the hierarchy, ranked below even artisans, regarded in Confucian thinking as people who profited from others' labour without contributing productive work themselves. They were prohibited by law from wearing silk, from riding horses, and from purchasing certain categories of land and title. A successful merchant in Han China was officially forbidden from dressing, as well as the minor officials whose salaries were a fraction of his income. The law maintained this position firmly for generations, right up until the point where various emperors, needing revenue, began selling the very titles and ranks that merchants were supposedly barred from obtaining. The merchants bought them with considerable enthusiasm, which suggests the prohibition had always been more performative than absolute. Women's lives across all social classes were organized primarily around the household, managing domestic production, raising children, maintaining the ritual obligations of ancestor worship and family ceremony that Confucian culture placed enormous weight on. Upper-class women had access to education, and the literary culture of Han China includes women who wrote poetry and prose of genuine quality. The ideal of the virtuous woman in Han culture was centered on qualities that were domestically expressed: frugality, careful management of household resources, proper conduct in relationship to parents-in-law and husband. But this did not mean women were absent from the intellectual life of their era. Empress Lu's career, whatever its moral complexities, demonstrates that proximity to political power was not exclusively a male experience. Children in Han society entered the formal structure of social obligation early. Filial piety toward parents and grandparents was not simply an abstract value. It was expressed through specific daily behaviors: the morning greeting, the offer of food, the attention to physical comfort that were expected regardless of other obligations. The mourning period required after a parent's death was 3 years in the full Confucian prescription, during which an official was expected to retire from his post and observe a specified set of restrictions. Some officials actually did this. Many found ways to abbreviate it. The emperor could grant a formal exemption from the mourning requirement for officials whose presence was deemed essential, a bureaucratic solution to an ideological problem that the Han court had apparently thought through with some care. Markets operated in designated areas of Han cities, open at specified times, with officials responsible for maintaining standard weights and measures and collecting the relevant taxes. Urban life in Chang'an and Luoyang included not just the administrative apparatus, but a substantial population of craftspeople, traders, entertainers, and the general supporting infrastructure of any large pre-industrial city. Acrobats, musicians, and storytellers performed in market areas. Cockfighting and various competitive games attracted crowds and wagers. The city, in other words, was recognizable as a city in ways that persist across enormous distances of time. The enemy at the northern wall. The Xiongnu did not think of themselves as a problem. From their perspective, they were a highly functional society that had organized the grasslands of Inner Asia with considerable sophistication, and the large agricultural empire to their south was a convenient source of goods that they wanted, and that could be obtained through a combination of trade, negotiation, and periodic raiding depending on which approach the circumstances favoured. That the Han Empire found this arrangement alarming and humiliating was, from the Xiongnu side, largely a matter of Han sensitivity. Understanding the conflict requires setting aside the idea that the Xiongnu were simply raiders who needed to be stopped. They were a confederated society of pastoral nomads, organized around a leader called the Qian, who held the loyalty of multiple tribal groups through a combination of military prestige, material distribution, and a political structure sophisticated enough to conduct diplomacy, maintain institutional memory across generations, and coordinate military operations across enormous distances. Their economy was built on animal husbandry, horses, sheep, cattle, and on the movement between seasonal pastures that this required. Warfare was simply one economic activity among others, and they were exceptionally good at it. The key figure in the transformation of the Xiongnu from a regional pressure into an empire-level threat was a Qian named Modu, who came to power around 209 BC through a succession struggle that the historical sources describe with considerable directness about its violence. Modu unified multiple competing steppe groups under a single confederacy, instituted military discipline based on the principle that an order had to be followed regardless of its target. He tested this on his own horses, his own wife, and eventually his own father, and created an organization capable of coordinating tens of thousands of mounted warriors over a geographic scale that no previous steppe power had managed. When Gaozu marched north in 200 BC and found himself surrounded at Baideng, He was encountering the product of this organization in full operation. The Han army, despite its numerical size, was fighting on terrain that favored mounted mobility over infantry formations, at a distance from its supply lines that made the engagement unsustainable. The Xiongnu did not need to defeat the Han army in a pitched battle. They simply needed to contain it long enough for the mathematics of supply to do their work. The Qin policy that followed was not chosen because Han officials thought it was a good solution. It was chosen because the available alternatives were worse. The terms involved sending a Han princess, in practice usually a woman of the imperial household, rather than an actual daughter, to become a wife of the Qianyu, accompanied by substantial quantities of silk, grain, wine, and other goods delivered on an annual basis. This was tribute dressed in the language of a marriage alliance, and everyone involved understood it as such. Han officials who wrote about it in their official capacity used careful language. Han officials who wrote more freely described it as a source of national shame that needed to be addressed as soon as the empire was capable of addressing it. The court debate about whether to change the policy, which ran intermittently through the reigns of Gaozu, Empress Lu, Emperor Wang, and Emperor Jing, was not simply an argument about military strategy. It was an argument about what kind of empire the Han was. The Confucian framework that was gradually becoming dominant held that a properly ordered world placed China at the centre, with surrounding peoples recognizing its superiority and arriving to pay tribute, not the other way around. The Qin arrangement inverted this picture completely. Sending silk and grain northward every year, and a woman to live in a felt tent, was not compatible with the self-image that the growing Confucian intellectual culture was constructing for the dynasty. Emperor Wu's decision to go on the offensive was grounded in real military preparation rather than pure ideology. The decades of careful governance under Emperors Wen and Jing had produced a treasury capable of funding large campaigns, a population large enough to supply substantial armies, and a period of relative border stability that had allowed the Han military to develop cavalry forces of its own, smaller and less experienced than the Xiongnu's, but increasingly capable. The strategic decision was to stop defending a line and start attacking the space behind it. The campaigns proceeded over roughly 2 decades in a series of major operations. What made them eventually decisive was not any single engagement, but the cumulative effect of sustained offensive pressure that the Xiongnu Confederacy could not indefinitely absorb. The recovery of the Ordos region, the loop of the Yellow River that the Xiongnu had used as a staging ground for raids into the Han heartland, removed their closest operating base. The campaigns through the Gansu corridor pushed them away from the routes connecting China to Central Asia. The deep strikes in 119 BC, coordinated by Wei Qing and Huo Kubing, operating simultaneously from different axes, pushed the Qianyu's court far enough into the Gobi that regular raiding into Han territory became logistically difficult. The Xiongnu responded with the tactic that steppe societies have always used against advancing armies they moved. Han cavalry would arrive at a location where the Xiongnu had been, and find empty grassland, abandoned campsites, and herds driven northward. Catching a mobile enemy that has chosen not to be caught, across terrain with no fixed infrastructure to defend or destroy, is one of the more persistent strategic problems in military history, and the Han armies experienced it in full. Several campaigns that were expensive and painful in terms of men and horses lost returned to Chang'an with minimal engagement to show for the effort. The financial cost of sustained offensive campaigning against the Xiongnu was the single largest drain on the Han treasury during Emperor Wu's reign. Horses were the critical resource, and they were consumed in enormous numbers, killed in battle, lost to disease and exhaustion on long marches across desert and steppe, simply unavailable in the quantities that large cavalry operations required. The state monopolies on salt and iron that Sang Hongyang administered were generating revenue, but the campaigns were spending it faster than it came in. By the later years of Emperor Wu's reign, the treasury was under real pressure, and the economic costs of the military program were visible in ways that his father and grandfather's careful stewardship had never produced. The eventual resolution of the Xiongnu problem came not from a final decisive military victory but from internal fracture. The sustained pressure of Han campaigns, combined with a series of harsh winters that devastated the Xiongnu livestock herds, produced divisions within the confederacy that the Han government was able to exploit diplomatically. In the decades after Emperor Wu's death, the Xiongnu split into northern and southern factions. The southern Xiongnu, weaker and closer to the Han frontier, chose submission, accepting a client relationship with the Han court that provided protection and material support in exchange for nominal acknowledgement of Han authority. Their leader came to Chang'an in 51 BC to perform formal submission, a ceremony that the Han court received with considerable satisfaction after the humiliations of the Qin era. The northern Xiongnu remained independent for longer, continuing to operate in the deeper steppe, but without the unity of Modu's confederacy, they were a diminishing threat. They would eventually be pushed further west by a combination of Han pressure and competition from other steppe groups, beginning a chain of migrations that would, over the following centuries, contribute to the pressure on Rome's northern frontiers. Whether this connection between Han military campaigns in Inner Asia and eventual trouble on the Rhine is as direct as some historians have suggested remains debated, but the basic trajectory of Xiongnu displacement westward after Han pressure is well documented. What the Xiongnu conflict left behind inside China was a military infrastructure, the garrison towns, the signal tower networks, the extended wall systems, the cavalry breeding programs that reshaped the northwestern landscape, and the administrative priorities of the Han state for generations. It also left a military class with experience in exactly the kind of mobile, long-distance warfare that would matter again when the empire's internal stability began to erode. What the Han gave the world. The military campaigns and court intrigues that fill most of the official histories tend to crowd out something equally significant about the Han Dynasty, the sustained intellectual and technical activity happening in its academies, workshops, observatories, and private studies during the same centuries. While emperors argued about Xiongnu policy and court factions maneuvered for position, other people were quietly doing things that would matter for a very long time. The most important single act of intellectual production in the entire Han period was not a military strategy or a philosophical treatise. It was a history. Sima Qian, who served as grand historian under Emperor Wu, spent approximately 2 decades writing the Shiji records of the Grand Historian, a work that covered Chinese history from the legendary Yellow Emperor down to his own time, organized across 130 chapters, treating imperial biographies, hereditary houses, chronological tables, treatises on specific subjects, and individual accounts of notable figures from across Chinese society. It was the first systematic, comprehensive history of China, and it established the form that official Chinese historiography would follow for the next 2,000 years. What makes Sima Qian's achievement remarkable beyond its scale is the circumstances under which he completed it. In approximately 99 BC, a Han general named Li Ling led a force deep into Xiongnu territory, was surrounded, ran out of arrows, and surrendered rather than die a decision that the Han court received with fury. Sima Qian was among the very few voices who spoke in Li Ling's defense, arguing that the general had fought bravely against impossible odds. Emperor Wu was not in a mood to hear this argument. Sima Qian was sentenced to castration, a punishment that, in the honor culture of Han China, was considered more degrading than execution, precisely because execution allowed a man to die intact. He had the option of paying a fine to commute the sentence. He did not have the money. He chose to survive rather than take his own life, which the alternative dignity available to him would have been, and he continued his work. He was explicit in his private writing about what this cost him personally. There is a letter he wrote to a friend that survives in fragmentary form, describing the humiliation in terms that carry no composure at all. He finished the Shiji anyway. China's greatest historian wrote the definitive account of his civilization while serving as a court eunuch, in conditions he had not chosen and never reconciled himself to. The book does not show it. The book is extraordinary. The other major technological development associated with the Han period, though its formal refinement came in the Eastern Han, was paper. Before paper, writing in China was done primarily on strips of bamboo or wood, bound together into bundles, or on expensive silk. Bamboo was heavy. A single document of any length required a bundle large enough to be physically cumbersome. The historical sources contain references to officials arriving with cartloads of memorials, which gives a useful physical picture of the administrative burden that bamboo-based record-keeping created. A later Han official named Kai Lun is traditionally credited with refining the papermaking process around 105 AD, producing a material made from bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets that was lighter, cheaper, and easier to produce than anything that had come before. The consequences of widely available writing material are difficult to overstate. Books became more portable. Libraries became more practical. The circulation of ideas, philosophical, scientific, administrative, literary, became less dependent on the resources required to copy texts onto bamboo or commission silk manuscripts. The gradual spread of literacy that had been underway during the Han period had a physical substrate to continue developing on. Paper moved along the Silk Road westward eventually, reaching the Islamic world and then Europe, where it would do something similar several centuries later. Han astronomy was a serious, systematic enterprise rather than an astrological tradition dressed in observational clothing, though the two were not clearly separated in Han thinking. Court astronomers maintained regular records of celestial events, the positions of planets, the appearances of comets, the occurrence of solar and lunar eclipses, and records of spots on the sun observed through jade or smoky crystal that represent some of the earliest documented sunspot observations anywhere in the world. The Han star catalogue contained over 2,500 individual stars, organized into groupings that provided a framework for tracking celestial movement with considerable precision. Zhang, an Eastern Han polymath who served in the imperial court in the early 2nd century AD, produced two inventions that stand as the clearest examples of Han technical ambition reaching beyond what any contemporary civilization was attempting. His armillary sphere, a mechanical model of the celestial sphere with concentric rings representing the major astronomical circles, was sophisticated enough to be operated by a water-powered mechanism, continuously tracking celestial movement. His seismoscope, constructed in 132 AD, was a bronze vessel containing a pendulum mechanism that, when the ground moved, caused a small ball to drop from one of 8 dragon figures around the rim into the mouth of a frog figure below, indicating the direction of the disturbance. When it registered a tremor that people in the capital could not feel, the court was skeptical about its reliability, until a messenger arrived from several hundred kilometers away confirming that an earthquake had indeed occurred in exactly the indicated direction. The 9 chapters on the mathematical art, a text compiled and edited during the Han period, though drawing on earlier material, contains the mathematical knowledge considered essential for practical governance methods, for calculating land areas, proportional distribution of goods and taxes, volumes of earthworks, interest on loans, and the extraction of square and cube roots. It includes a method for solving simultaneous linear equations that would not appear in European mathematics for another 15 centuries. Its orientation was almost entirely practical, which tells you something about what the Han government considered mathematics useful for. Han medicine developed within a theoretical framework that understood the body as a system of flows and balances of qi, of blood, of yin and yang energies that required maintenance and could be disrupted in specific ways. The foundational medical texts of the Han period, including the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, organized this understanding into a comprehensive system covering diagnosis, acupuncture, herbal treatments, and the relationship between seasonal and environmental factors and bodily health. How well this framework matched biological reality in every particular is a question that medicine has been examining for centuries, but the systematic observation of symptoms and treatments it encoded contained genuine clinical insight alongside its theoretical apparatus. Emperor Wu's establishment of the Music Bureau, the Yuefu, in approximately 112 BC had cultural consequences that outlasted its original purpose. The Bureau was tasked initially with collecting folk songs from across the empire for use in court rituals and ceremonial music, as well as composing new music appropriate to the dynasty's grandeur. What it also did, incidentally, was preserve the words of those folk songs in written form, creating an archive of popular poetry from ordinary communities that would otherwise have disappeared entirely. The Yuefu poems that survived describing soldiers far from home, women waiting, the difficulty of farming life, the pleasures of market days provide a texture of Han daily experience that official histories do not contain. The bronze and iron industries continued at a scale and sophistication that supplied not just weapons and tools, but the full range of objects that Han material culture required. The crossbow, which had existed before the Han, was refined during this period into a mechanically sophisticated weapon, using a bronze trigger mechanism of remarkable precision, consistent enough in its manufacture that standardized parts could be replaced in the field, a feature that most modern analysts consider a genuinely significant military technological development. Many of the bronze trigger mechanisms recovered from Han sites are interchangeable, produced to tolerances that imply a degree of standardized manufacturing that is not usually associated with pre-industrial production. Taken together, these achievements do not add up to a scientific revolution in the modern sense. Han thinkers were not constructing systematic theories designed to be tested and refined through controlled experimentation, but they were observing carefully, recording systematically, building on previous work, and asking practical questions with the seriousness that sustained intellectual cultures produce. The foundation they built was deep enough that later Chinese civilization had an enormous amount to work with. The man who stole a throne. The Western Han did not end with a dramatic military collapse or a foreign invasion. It ended with paperwork carefully prepared. Confucian language paperwork and a man who had spent decades making himself appear to be exactly what the dynasty needed, before quietly becoming something else entirely. To understand how Mang happened, it helps to trace the gradual deterioration of the Western Han court in the generations after Emperor Wu. The 54-year reign had left the dynasty militarily expanded and financially strained, and the emperors who followed a succession that included Emperor Zhao, Emperor Xuan, Emperor Yuan, Emperor Cheng, Emperor Ai, and finally Emperor Ping, were shorter reigning, less commanding figures navigating a court that had grown more complex and more factious over time. The administrative machinery that Confucian governance had created was functional, but its uppermost levels had become increasingly contested by the families of Empress dowagers, who found that proximity to weak emperors was a reliable path to actual power. The Wang family, related to the throne through Emperor Yuan's principal consort, accumulated influence across multiple reigns with a patience that suggests either extraordinary collective discipline or extraordinary collective opportunity, possibly both. By the time Emperor Cheng, notorious in the historical record, less for his governance than for his enthusiastic personal life, was on the throne, the Wang family had relatives occupying a significant portion of the senior court positions. One of the family's members, a nephew of the Empress Dowager, had developed a particular reputation that set him apart from the general pattern of aristocratic court manoeuvring. Wang Mang was, by all accounts, conspicuously virtuous. In an era when court officials were expected to accumulate wealth and display it, he gave away his inheritance to the poor. He dressed simply. He observed mourning rituals with scrupulous completeness, including the full 3-year withdrawal from office that most officials found ways to abbreviate. He treated scholars with genuine respect and was treated by them with genuine admiration in return. He was the kind of man that the Confucian system was theoretically designed to produce, and this reputation was not entirely performance. The scholars who praised him were not, for the most part, simply saying what was expected of them. He was also watching everything very carefully and understanding it with a precision that purely virtuous men rarely demonstrate. When Emperor Ping died in 5 AD under circumstances that later historians questioned, though the evidence is not conclusive, Wang Mang was the dominant figure at court and was serving as regent for the infant successor who was placed on the throne. He governed in the emperor's name for 4 years, consolidating his position, managing the court's various factions, and receiving increasingly extravagant formal honours from officials and scholars who had either genuinely convinced themselves he deserved them or were making a practical assessment about where the future lay. In 9 AD, the infant emperor formally abdicated, the documents were prepared, the ceremonies were conducted, the Confucian ritual framework was deployed to give the transition the appearance of heaven's mandate being properly transferred, and Wang Mang declared the establishment of the Qin Dynasty, meaning the new dynasty. He was the first man since the founding of the Han to claim the throne without being a member of the Liu family, and he did it without a military campaign, without a civil war, without anything more forceful than the management of court politics and the construction of a reputation over many years. The imperial court accepted this. The senior officials accepted it. The scholars who had praised Wang Mang accepted it. It remains one of the more remarkable political transitions in Chinese history, an usurpation that generated almost no immediate resistance, because the man doing it had made himself genuinely difficult to oppose within the framework that the culture valued. Then he started governing, and the difficulty became apparent. Wang Mang's reform program was driven by a sincere belief rooted in his Confucian scholarship that the problems of the late Western Han could be solved by returning to what he understood as the institutions of the former ancient Zhou dynasty. The Zhou had theoretically owned all land under heaven, distributing it to the people as a kind of state stewardship rather than private property. The Han had allowed large private landholdings to develop, which Wang Mang believed was the source of the inequality and social instability that had been growing for generations. His solution was to nationalize all land and redistribute it according to a formula based on household size. This proposal managed to alienate the aristocracy, the large landholding families, and every regional power that had spent generations accumulating the estates that were now to be taken from them, all at once. And before Wang Mang had demonstrated any capacity to enforce his will against organized resistance, his currency reforms achieved something similar in the commercial sphere. He replaced the existing coin system with a new and more complex one, then replaced that with another new system, and then modified that system again. Each revision was grounded in elaborate cosmological reasoning about the proper relationship between metal, number, and value that made perfect sense within its own theoretical framework, and complete chaos in any marketplace where merchants were trying to agree on what a chicken was worth. Trade contracted, credit dried up. People who had been operating straightforward commercial businesses found themselves unable to determine with any confidence what their money was worth from one season to the next. He renamed things. Geographic names were changed to match ancient Zhou terminology. Official titles were revised. The Xiongnu, who had been submitting to Han authority under a carefully negotiated arrangement, were informed by Wang Mang that their new status would be reflected in a title that translated roughly as a demotion, which unsurprisingly disrupted the stability that several generations of patient diplomacy had produced on the northern frontier. In 11 AD, the Yellow River changed course. This was not Wang Mang's fault. The river had been building toward a major channel shift through decades of silting, but the timing was catastrophic. The new course flooded enormous areas of agricultural land in the east, displacing populations, destroying crops, and overwhelming the administrative capacity of a government already struggling to implement a reform agenda that most of the people it was supposed to help had not asked for and did not understand. Famine followed the flooding in patterns that compound disasters typically produce. The rebellions that emerged from this accumulation of problems were multiple and overlapping. The most historically significant was a movement known as the Red Eyebrows. Its followers marked themselves with red paint on their foreheads, which gave the rebellion a visible identity and apparently required a certain personal commitment to the cause from the moment you picked up the brush. They were primarily famine refugees and dispossessed farmers from the eastern flood regions, and they fought not with any coherent political program, but with the specific energy of people who have nothing left to lose and are directing their anger at whoever represents the order that failed them. Regional military leaders and surviving members of the Liu family, the Han imperial line that Wang Mang had displaced, raised their own forces in the general chaos. By 23 AD, multiple armies were converging on the capital from different directions. Wang Mang, who had built his power through court politics and the patient management of a functioning system, was not equipped for this situation. He was killed during the fall of Chang'an, reportedly found by the soldiers who entered his last position, still consulting his ritual implements and classical texts for guidance on what to do next. He had ruled for 14 years. His reforms had failed comprehensively. His dynasty ended with him. The historical tradition has treated him mostly as a cautionary figure, a man whose idealism outran his practical judgment, who diagnosed real problems and applied solutions so poorly fitted to reality that they accelerated the collapse he was trying to prevent. More recent historical reassessment has been somewhat kinder, acknowledging that the problems he identified were genuine and that some of his instincts about inequality and land concentration were not wrong, even when his methods for addressing them were disastrous. What he left behind was a China requiring, once again, someone capable of pulling the pieces back together. The Han returns. The years between Wang Mang's death in 23 AD and the establishment of a stable new order were not years that any participant would have described as an improvement. The Red Eyebrow forces that had stormed Chang'an were capable of destroying a government, but not of replacing it. They had no administrative personnel, no financial system, no coherent political program beyond the immediate release of accumulated grievance. They installed a figurehead claiming Han descent, ran through the stored resources of the capital with considerable efficiency, and within a few years found themselves holding a city they could not feed, surrounded by better organized forces they could not defeat. Meanwhile, across the former Han territories, a landscape of competing warlords, regional strongmen, and Han restoration claimants was sorting itself out through the mechanism that political landscapes without a dominant centre tend to use a prolonged sequence of military engagements that gradually reduce the number of viable contestants until one was left. The man who emerged from this process was named Liu Shu, and his background carried a deliberate historical symmetry. He was a descendant of the Han imperial family, tracing his lineage back to Emperor Jing through a branch that had been growing more distant from the throne with each generation for nearly 2 centuries, to the point where Liu Shu had grown up farming his family's land in a way that would have been entirely unremarkable if his genealogy hadn't suddenly become relevant. The distance of his connection to the main Han line was far enough back that establishing it required a genealogical argument of some complexity, which his supporters advanced with the confidence of people who understood that the argument's political usefulness mattered more than its elegance. He was in his late 20s when the uprisings began, and he joined the Han Restoration movement with a group that included his older brother Liu Yan, who had the more prominent early profile and the clearer political ambitions. Liu Yan was killed in the factional manoeuvring of the early uprising period, which removed a figure who might otherwise have competed with Liu Shu for leadership of the restoration cause, and who might also, depending on temperament, have handled that leadership very differently. The engagement that most clearly announced Liu Shu as a significant military figure was the Battle of Kunyang in 23 AD, fought against a much larger force from Wang Mang's remaining army. The details that survive suggest that Liu Shu personally led a small cavalry force in a series of strikes against the flanks and rear of the larger army, while the main Han forces held the city's walls, and that a combination of this pressure and a violent storm that struck during the engagement broke the Wang Mang force decisively. The scale of the victory relative to the apparent disparity of forces gave Liu Shu a military reputation that served him throughout the subsequent campaigns. Over the next 2 years, the political landscape continued its violent simplification. Liu Shu maneuvered carefully through the competing factions, sometimes fighting, sometimes negotiating, building a coalition while maintaining enough independence from the more unstable elements of the Restoration movement to avoid being pulled down when they collapsed. In 25 AD, he declared himself emperor at Luoyang, founding what Chinese history calls the Eastern Han because Luoyang sat considerably east of Chang'an, the capital of the Western Han that he was consciously continuing. The choice of Luoyang over Chang'an was not simply geographical. Chang'an had been sacked twice in the chaos of the interregnum and was in genuine physical disrepair. More significantly, it was associated with Wang Mang's failed dynasty and with the Western Han court culture that had produced the conditions for Wang Mang's rise. Luoyang offered a fresh start, in a location that had different historical associations and different existing power structures. It was also closer to the eastern regions where Liu Shu's support base was concentrated, which was a practical consideration of some importance for an emperor still in the process of consolidating his hold on the empire. The governing philosophy of Emperor Guangwu, the title Liu Shu received, meaning roughly brilliant martial emperor, a name that somewhat overstates his enthusiasm for actual warfare, was shaped throughout by a sustained consciousness of what had gone wrong before him. Wang Mang had tried to do too much at once, with too little practical grounding, through administrative mechanisms that the existing society could not support. Guangwu's response was to do less deliberately, and to build from what was verifiably working, rather than from what was theoretically correct. He reduced the central government bureaucracy significantly, cutting the number of official positions and consolidating departments that had expanded during the Western Han into a leaner administrative structure. He did not attempt to nationalize land. He did not attempt comprehensive monetary reform. He did not rename the geographic features of the empire or revise the titles of foreign leaders into something more Confucianly appropriate. The problems that Wang Mang had identified: large landholdings concentrated in aristocratic families, inequality between social classes, a tax burden falling heavily on the farming population, were real, and Guangwu did not pretend otherwise. His approach to them was to lower the tax rate, conduct land surveys to produce more accurate tax assessments, and allow the natural recovery process that had worked under Emperors Wen and Jing to operate again, rather than engineering a solution that required forcing the existing social structure into a new shape. His treatment of defeated enemies was notable enough that the historical sources remark on it with some frequency. Warlords who submitted to his authority were generally allowed to keep their lives, their households, and in several cases their regional standing, in exchange for genuine disarmament and acknowledgement of imperial authority. This approach required confidence. Offering generous terms to men who had recently been your military opponents carried the risk that they would interpret generosity as weakness, but it also dramatically reduced the cost of consolidation, both in material resources and in the sustained administrative attention that suppressing resentful former enemies would have required. The demobilization of the military forces that had helped him win was handled with similar practical care. Many of the regional commanders who had contributed to his campaigns were given honorary titles, material rewards, and a retirement from active military command that was framed as honor rather than removal. A few resisted this process and were dealt with directly. Most accepted it, which suggests that Guangwu had read the room correctly about what his supporters actually wanted: recognition and security, versus what they claimed to want: which was continued military autonomy. By the early decades of his reign, the basic contours of Eastern Han stability were visible. The granaries were filling again, as they had under Emperors Wen and Jing. Population surveys, a fundamental tool of Han administration for assessing the tax base and conscription pool, showed recovery from the devastating losses of the interregnum years. The Silk Road routes disrupted during Wang Mang's disastrous handling of the western frontier relationships were being re-established. The southern Xiongnu, who had submitted to Han authority in the late Western Han period, remained within the client relationship that kept the northern frontier manageable. Guangwu Di died in 57 AD, having reigned for 32 years. He was, by the judgment of most historians who have examined the Eastern Han closely, exactly what the moment required, a man of genuine ability who understood the limits of what the situation could support and worked effectively within them rather than against them. He was not Emperor Wu. He was not trying to be. The Han Dynasty had already demonstrated what it looked like when an emperor tried to transform everything at once, and the lesson had been sufficiently vivid that working more carefully seemed, under the circumstances, like the wiser approach. What he handed to his successors was a functioning empire with rebuilt institutions, recovering demographics, and a capital at Luoyang that would anchor the Eastern Han for the next century and a half. Whether that inheritance would be maintained carefully depended entirely on who came next and what pressures they found waiting for them. An empire aging slowly. The Eastern Han's first 3 emperors after Guangwu maintained the careful energy he had established, and for several decades the dynasty continued developing in ways that looked, from the outside, like a story of sustained success. Emperor Ming, who reigned from 57 to 75 AD, was a capable administrator who extended Han authority and supported the expansion of the Imperial Academy. He is also associated, through a tradition recorded in later sources, with one of the most consequential cultural introductions of the era, the formal arrival of Buddhism in China. The story involves an imperial dream, a vision of a golden figure, and an embassy dispatched westward that returned with texts and 2 Indian monks who were housed in a temple built just outside Luoyang's walls. Whether the precise details of this account are literally accurate, Buddhist practice was establishing itself in China during this period, carried in through the Central Asian corridors that Zhang Qian had opened, and spreading gradually among communities with access to the Silk Road networks. Emperor Zhang followed, and then Emperor He, and under Emperor He the Eastern Han reached what was arguably its furthest physical extension. The figure responsible for this was a military commander named Ban Chao, who had begun his career as a copyist. He was the brother of the historian Ban Gu and the remarkable scholar Ban Zhao, before concluding that copying documents was less suited to his temperament than the alternative, and volunteering for an expedition to the western regions in 73 AD. He spent the next 30 years in Central Asia. Ban Chao's career in the West involved a combination of military engagement, diplomatic negotiation, and the kind of sustained personal commitment to a mission that generally requires not thinking too hard about what you are missing at home. He worked systematically through the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin, bringing them back into tributary relationships with Han authority through a mixture of persuasion and force, applied with enough precision to be effective without being so heavy-handed as to create permanent resentment. He rebuilt the network of Han influence in Central Asia that had collapsed during Wang Mang's interregnum and the subsequent chaos. In 97 AD, he sent an envoy named Gan Ying westward with instructions to reach Dakin, the Roman Empire. Gan Ying travelled as far as the Persian Gulf, where Parthian sailors, according to the Chinese sources, informed him that the sea crossing to Rome was extremely long and dangerous, and that many men had spent years at sea and longed intensely for home by the end of it. Gan Ying turned around. The Parthians, who had a significant commercial interest in remaining the intermediaries between China and Rome, may have been understating the practical accessibility of the route, but Gan Ying had no way to evaluate their account and the first direct contact between the Han Empire and Rome never happened. Ban Chao himself returned to Luoyang in 102 AD in his early 70s and died there within a year, having spent more of his adult life in Central Asia than in China. The structural problems that would eventually unravel the Eastern Han were not visible in any single moment, but were accumulating through tendencies that the dynasty's success had obscured rather than resolved. The most immediately practical was the age of its emperors. Guangwu Di had been in his 30s when he took the throne, Emperor Ming was in his early 30s, and Emperor Zhang similarly. But Emperor He came to the throne at 9 years old. His successor, Emperor Shang, reigned for a few months before dying in infancy. Emperor An came to power at 13. The pattern continued. The Eastern Han produced a sequence of child emperors and short-reigning adults that left effective governance continuously in the hands of regents, and the regents were typically drawn from the families of empress dowagers, who repeated the structural pattern that had defined the late Western Han. A court organized around a child emperor required someone to make actual decisions, and the someone making those decisions was rarely who the formal hierarchy said it should be. Into this environment, the eunuch's palace servants who had been castrated and whose access to the imperial household made them indispensable intermediaries between the emperor and the outside world, gradually accumulated influence of a kind that alarmed the Confucian scholar-official class profoundly. The alarm was not unreasonable. Eunuchs who controlled physical access to the emperor controlled, in practice, a significant portion of what the emperor knew, whom he saw, and what decisions he made. Under a capable adult emperor, this was manageable. Under a child emperor, or a weak one, the person controlling information was effectively governing. The conflict between the eunuch faction and the scholar-official class sharpened through the middle and late 2nd century AD into something that consumed enormous amounts of the court's attention and energy. Scholar officials who criticized eunuch influence were accused of forming dangerous political factions, a charge with serious Confucian connotations. Since personal loyalty should theoretically be given to the emperor, rather than to any private network, and in 166 AD, the court issued the first of the partisan prohibitions, banning a group of prominent scholar officials from government service on the grounds that they were organizing an improper partisan network. A second prohibition followed in 169 AD, and the effect was to remove from government exactly the kind of educated, principled officials that the Confucian examination system had been designed to produce and place in power. They were replaced by the patronage networks of the eunuch faction, which operated on entirely different principles. The scholar officials who were banned from government did not quietly accept their removal. They continued to write, to correspond, to build reputations for principled resistance that made them enormously popular among the educated class, while simultaneously ensuring that the court's internal conflict remained unresolved and consuming. The eunuchs and the scholar officials were pulling at the same institutional fabric from opposite ends, and neither had the ability to simply win. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD emerged from a completely different direction and revealed how much the empire's interior had deteriorated while the court was occupied with its own conflicts. The movement was organized around a religious framework, drawing on Taoist traditions, promising healing, spiritual equality, and an end to a corrupt age. And it spread rapidly across multiple northern and eastern provinces through networks of believers who had been prepared for years before the open rising began. The coordination was impressive, simultaneous uprisings across a wide area, and the initial response required the Han court to authorize regional military commanders to raise and fund their own armies, since the central military capacity had atrophied in ways that the regular garrison system could not compensate for. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was suppressed within a year, which is itself remarkable given its scale, but the method of suppression created the condition for what followed. Regional commanders who had raised private armies to fight the Yellow Turbans now had those armies, and the Han court had neither the resources nor the authority to disband them effectively. The next serious crisis, a court coup in 189 AD, involving a warlord named Dong Zhuo, who marched his army into Luoyang, deposed one emperor, installed another, and proceeded to govern through direct military intimidation, demonstrated exactly what those private armies meant for the dynasty's future. The response to Dong Zhuo was a coalition of regional lords who raised forces against him, coordinated loosely enough that they managed to push him out of Luoyang, but not loosely enough to then agree on what to do next. Dong Zhuo retreated west, burned Luoyang before he left, including its libraries and records, and the coalition promptly collapsed into internal competition among its members for the territory and resources the campaign had made available. The emperor, a young man whose authority was now entirely nominal, was moved from place to place by whichever warlord currently held him, a living symbol of legitimacy that various regional powers needed to be associated with, but none were willing to actually restore to power. The Han Dynasty still existed in the formal sense. The empire it had built was fragmenting into the private domains of men with armies. The long goodbye. The last decades of the Han Dynasty have a particular quality in the historical record, a kind of slow, almost reluctant unravelling, in which the formal structures outlasted the reality they were supposed to represent by so long that the gap between them became the defining feature of the era. The emperor kept existing. The title kept being used. The administrative forms kept being observed, and none of it meant what it once had. The figure who most shaped this final period was Cao Cao, a man who stands as one of the more genuinely complicated figures in all of Chinese history, and who spent most of his career insisting that he was a loyal Han minister while systematically removing every remaining source of Han authority that was not himself. He was the son of a man who had been adopted into a prominent eunuch family, which gave him a social position unusual enough that later enemies could use his origins against him rhetorically, and capable enough that it did not slow him down in practice. He was a military commander of real talent, an administrator of considerable energy, a poet of genuine quality, and a political operator who was comfortable thinking several moves ahead in environments where most participants were still sorting out the current situation. In 196 AD, Cao Cao escorted the Han Emperor, Emperor Qian, a young man who had been moved around like luggage by various warlords for several years, to a new capital at Shu, where he would remain for the next quarter century under Cao Cao's protection. The word protection, in this context, carried the particular meaning it carries when used by the most powerful armed man in the room. Emperor Qian continued to perform the ceremonial functions of an emperor. He continued to issue edicts, receive reports, and conduct the ritual observances that imperial tradition required. The edicts that Cao Cao wanted issued were issued. The ones he did not want issued were not. This arrangement was understood by everyone involved, and everyone involved found ways to discuss it that stopped just short of naming it plainly. Cao Cao spent the following decade consolidating control of the north through a series of military campaigns that demonstrated his characteristic combination of decisive movement and careful administration of conquered territory. He was not simply a conqueror, he implemented agricultural recovery programs in the regions he controlled, resettled displaced populations onto abandoned farmland, and built a functioning economic base in the north that gave his subsequent campaigns the material foundation they required. By 208 AD, he controlled most of northern China and was moving south to complete what looked, from his position, like the imminent reunification of the empire. The Battle of Red Cliffs stopped him. On the Yangtze River, a coalition of forces led by the southeastern warlord Sun Quan and a Han claimant named Liu Bei engaged Cao Cao's southward advance. His much larger navy was destroyed, according to the most dramatic accounts, by a fireship attack on a fleet that had been chained together to provide stability for soldiers unused to water. The fire itself is well attested. The precise tactical details have been elaborated by 2,000 years of storytelling until it is difficult to know where history ends and a very good story begins. What is certain is that Cao Cao retreated north. The southeast remained outside his control, and the moment for quick reunification had passed. The three powers that would become the three kingdoms were now visible in outline. Cao Cao held the north, the old Han heartland, the population centres, the agricultural base. Sun Quan held the southeast, the Yangtze region, growing in economic importance, defensible behind its rivers. Liu Bei, who claimed descent from the Han imperial family through a line remote enough to require the same kind of genealogical confidence that Liu Shu had deployed 2 centuries earlier, established himself in the southwest, in the Sichuan basin and surrounding territories, and built his claim to legitimacy around the argument that he was the continuation of the Han, not its successor. Cao Cao died in 220 AD without having taken the final step of deposing the emperor and claiming the throne himself. He had accepted every honour and title the Han system could offer, had reduced the emperor to complete powerlessness, had governed the north as its effective ruler for decades, and had never formally made himself emperor. Whether this was principle, caution, a calculation about how the act would be received, or simply a preference for the present arrangement, is something historians have debated without reaching consensus. His son Cao Pi had no such hesitation. Within months of his father's death, Cao Pi orchestrated Emperor Qian's abdication, accepted the transfer of the mandate of heaven with the formal ceremonies that the Confucian ritual framework prescribed, and declared the establishment of the Wei dynasty. Emperor Qian, the last Han emperor, was given a title, a residence, lands, and a reasonable degree of material comfort. He lived for another 14 years, dying in 234 AD of what the sources describe as natural causes, in his mid-50s. He had been emperor since the age of 9, and had exercised genuine imperial authority for perhaps none of it. The Han Dynasty had officially ended. Liu Bei, in the following year, declared his own kingdom of Han in the southwest, insisting that the true mandate had not been transferred to Cao Pi, but remained with the Liu family. But this was a claim about legitimacy rather than a continuation of the empire, and it did not long outlast Liu Bei himself. What had ended was not just a dynasty. 4 centuries of continuous institutional development, administrative practice, cultural production, and shared identity had shaped China in ways that no subsequent disruption would fully undo. The Han had taken a collection of former warring states with deep regional identities and built something that thought of itself, increasingly and genuinely, as a single civilization. The writing system had been standardized. The Confucian examination pathway had established the principle, however imperfectly realized, that governing ability rather than birth should determine official selection. The Silk Road had connected China to the wider world in ways that could not be unconnected simply because a dynasty had ended. Paper was circulating knowledge at scales that bamboo strips never had. The Chinese people who came after the Han did not call themselves Qin people, though the Qin had given China its name to the outside world. They called themselves Han people, a designation that has persisted through every subsequent dynasty, every invasion, every period of fragmentation, every transformation, all the way to the present. The word for the Chinese script is Han characters. The dominant ethnic group is the Han. The language is sometimes called Han language. The weight of what those 4 centuries built pressed itself permanently into the vocabulary people used to describe who they were. The Three Kingdoms period that followed the Han's end is one of the most romanticized eras in Chinese historical memory, celebrated in literature, drama, and eventually film and games, to a degree that sometimes makes it difficult to recall that it represented a catastrophic fragmentation of everything the Han had built. Population estimates for the period immediately following the Han suggest numbers dramatically lower than the late Han peak, the result of decades of warfare, famine, plague, and displacement. What the Han had gathered together and sustained took generations to reassemble, but reassemble it did, under the Qin Dynasty and later under the Sui and Tang, each restoration drawing on the Han template, the Confucian official class, the the centralized administration, the ritual framework for legitimacy, as the model of what a functioning Chinese empire should look like. No dynasty that came after the Han could avoid defining itself in relation to it, either as continuation, restoration, or improvement. The Han was the baseline. There is something worth sitting with in that persistence. Empires are usually remembered for their moments of greatest power, their conquests, their monuments, their famous rulers. The Han had all of these. But what made it genuinely lasting was something quieter. The habits of governance it established, the intellectual framework it institutionalized, the shared identity it cultivated over 4 centuries of imperfect, complicated, sometimes brutal, sometimes remarkable existence. These things proved more durable than any wall or palace. The dynasty had begun with a peasant farmer releasing his prisoners and heading into the hills with whoever would follow him. It ended with a young man handing over a seal and accepting a comfortable retirement. Between those 2 moments, China had been made. And there it is, 4 centuries quietly told. The Han rose from rubble and ended slowly, as most great things do, not with a single crash, but with a long, gradual loosening. And yet everything it built, the language, the identity, the idea of China itself simply kept going. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now. And if this one settled well with you, a like or a subscribe means more than you might think, or leave a thought in the comments below. But for now, let your body go heavy. Let the emperors and generals and silk roads drift somewhere quiet. Close your eyes. Good night.